Ready for your weekly tech fix? Want to know how technology sets us free? Well, get ready because here it comes. Tired of boring specials about history, science, and technology? Then get on your best headphones because you might want to lay down for this. A Sovryn Tech special with the world's foremost anarchist technophile, Brian Sovryn. He has a huge, well, you know. And now, here's Brian.
Hello and welcome to Sovryn Tech. It is I, Brian Sovryn, here with you for another great special. We've got a fantastic guest today that I'm very, very excited to talk to, and it is Stanislav Shalunov, who I will for short call Stas. Stas, great to have you here.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, now you are with Open Garden, which is, I will just say at the onset, it is a software that I use. I use it on my Android. I also use it on my Windows laptop. But if you would, if you know, let me know what is Open Garden for my listeners that don't know.
Open Garden is a software that can run on Android, Mac, and Windows, and it creates new wireless connections between devices nearby, making internet connection better for devices that have it, and giving internet connection to devices that don't have it. So you can enjoy internet access from your tablet through your phone when you're out and about, or when there are multiple phones near each other, they can rely on each other's connection to improve the coverage and speed of the carrier service.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Just off what protocol, what radio essentially does Open Garden use? It uses Bluetooth, is that right, or is there something more?
Open Garden is agnostic with respect to the radio protocol. We support anything that the devices currently support. The most widespread protocols that are of use today are Bluetooth 2.1 EDR and Wi-Fi Direct. In future, as Bluetooth 4.0 high-speed is more widely available, or if there are other protocols that appear, we will support those as well.
Okay, so right now, I mean, pretty much if I put say for starters, now I'm aware there's a lot of different things that it seems like Open Garden can do. But if I have the program installed on my computer, on my desktop, and then I have, or laptop or whichever, and then I have, on my Android phone, I have Open Garden installed. I can tether the signal, my 3G signal from my Android phone, and I can get it to go, and then my computer, if I don't have internet access any other way, I get internet access. Is that accurate?
That's one of the ways to use Open Garden. Open Garden is a general tool that improves your internet connectivity. So giving internet connectivity to a computer that doesn't have it is one of the ways in which it can improve it. In case of laptops and desktops, since Windows and Mac don't yet support Wi-Fi Direct, the protocol that you'd be using is Bluetooth. Between modern tablets and modern Android phones, typically it will be Wi-Fi Direct.
Now, Wi-Fi Direct, that's where, I mean, it's not necessarily newer, but essentially it's a newer tech where Wi-Fi devices can just talk between each other using, like an 802.11 signal of some kind. Is that right?
That's correct. It is basically ad hoc Wi-Fi take two, if you want to view it this way. The good thing about it is that it can be used concurrently with AP mode Wi-Fi as long as they're on the same channel. So you can stay on the internet using Wi-Fi and at the same time use Wi-Fi Direct to connect to other devices.
Okay, and Open Garden can take full advantage of this. And like you said, you designed it to where any future protocols that come out, it can also be used for those. Now, one of the interesting areas where I've seen this used was recently at the Porcupine Freedom Festival in New Hampshire, which is where the show is based out of, and at PorcFest, people were essentially, they were doing a mesh network. Could you tell me more about mesh networking in general? And then I can describe more what I saw.
Right. So traditionally, mesh networking, we're stretching the meaning of the term a little bit. So if you're familiar with mesh networks as they emerged using things like 802.11s, using various MANET protocols, this will be a little different. The mesh networking feature of OpenGarden is the ability of devices to connect to one another and form a connected graph of devices covering a geographic area. This does not switch off any of the existing internet connections, which is the important difference in OpenGarden and some of the other approaches to mesh networking. Also, it does not require you to root your phone or do anything unusual. All you need to do is just install the software. The devices, once connected, will access the internet collectively. So all the available capacity available to any device on that mesh network will be available potentially to any other, depending on how the system chooses to route based on quality of connections inside the mesh, battery level, history of access, and so forth.
Well, that's incredible. So, so essentially now I saw that at the Porcupine Freedom Festival, we got a few devices connected there. OpenGarden was kind of, I'll say they were beta testing or field testing there. And in that, like you saw on the app on Android devices, and this is where it was mainly used, you saw like a web, like a spider's web right on your phone or tablet. And it showed you, all these different connections going on. And so essentially, but here's my question. Now, one device would have an internet connection there, and then that could share it with all the other devices connected through OpenGarden. But could, say there was 20 devices, could 5 of those devices be connected to the internet and all 20 could take advantage of all 5 devices grabbing their internet? Do you get what I'm saying?
Of course, that's the whole point. And they don't even have to be connected directly to the devices that do have internet connection. They can go through other devices. The Android implementations of both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi Direct only allow a limited number of connections. So you cannot necessarily always build a full mesh of connectivity, but you can hop from one device to the other and get to the internet fairly quickly. And we keep the number of these hops pretty small in any reasonable network.
Okay, so is there any limit? There's a limitation on hops, but not a limitation on the amount of devices that can connect.
Not really. There is technically no limitation either way. As the number of hops increases, you will experience higher latency. But if it's Bluetooth, if it's Wi-Fi Direct, the increase in latency is not really significant. We make sure that for reliability and speed reasons, that the diameter of this graph is as low as possible.
Right. Okay. Now, like I said, we tested it at PorcFest and a couple times. It seemed to be working pretty good. Bluetooth, of course, is getting better all the time. That's how the connections were working at the Porcupine Freedom Festival, was through Bluetooth. And is this something where, like, say with with the idea of using it as a mesh networking service, which I think a lot of people are pretty excited about with it. I think the tethering ability of it is pretty nice too, because that can save you a nice chunk of change, off your cell phone bill. As compared to turning your cell phone or whatever into having to pay for it to be a hotspot. You could just use OpenGarden, directly. But anyway, with more of the mesh networking idea, the speeds were, they're limited by the radio protocol, right? And so is this something where you could say you're, in the mesh networking idea, you're connected to one device that has, the internet connection, and say you wanted to, watch a video on YouTube. Are the speeds there to watch video, to stream video?
Even on Bluetooth, you can get with even Bluetooth 2.1, the older version of Bluetooth, you can get up to 3 megabit per second, which is not great HD quality, and you may not get the whole 3 megabit, you may end up with 2, but this is decent video quality, and it's definitely possible to watch it.
Right.
Now, hardware for Bluetooth can be of various quality. It depends on lots of phones that we've never seen, lots of chipsets that may not have the best implementation. Sometimes there are cost-cutting measures and speed of Bluetooth. On a high-end phone, you'll get close to what 2.1 EDR can provide. On a lower end, maybe it may not be sufficient.
Right. I mean, because, I ask that only because I think a lot of people, when they hear about this sort of thing, they're like, okay, wow, now I've got free, potentially free internet, and now I can go and torrent a bunch of stuff where I can just watch all these YouTube videos all day. And so you're saying OpenGarden, it's really more up to the hardware as far as what can be transmitted, as far as what OpenGarden can do. But OpenGarden itself is really designed to give you a really good internet experience.
Yeah, we introduce no interesting limitation on the transmission speed. If you look at OpenGarden's CPU consumption, when your radio interfaces are fully saturated with traffic, you will not even see OpenGarden appear as a CPU consumer compared to whatever is using these bytes, your video player or your browser.
Right.
So OpenGarden is not the limit here. Whatever the hardware can do, will do. And you'll get faster. If speed is of primary concern, really today the answer is Wi-Fi Direct.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm curious, another thing with mobile devices, and again, OpenGarden can go beyond that, but with mobile devices in particular, a lot of people wonder about, battery consumption. Like you said, there's not a whole lot of, not a whole lot of hardware consumption essentially on the part of OpenGarden, which is great. But just having like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth on an Android, can drain the battery pretty good. Is Wi-Fi Direct also superior as far as battery life, or is Bluetooth the greater drain of the battery?
So there are many misconceptions and correct ideas about how battery life on phones works.
Okay.
And since the battery life on phones is so poor, we tend to develop various rituals to improve it. Some of these rituals are productive, but most of them are not. And in particular, there are people who like to switch their Wi-Fi on and off, Bluetooth on and off, to only use it when they need it, as they put it. That typically is not productive. That will give you lower battery life than just leaving all the interfaces up. The more productive things are making sure that nothing runs on the background that doesn't need to be running. If battery life is short, that's the productive avenue. Now, OpenGarden itself consumes very little battery as application. It'll consume less battery than your weather widget for sure, and comparable to, I don't know, some clock widget or something like that.
Yeah.
And the battery consumed by OpenGarden is the battery primarily consumed by the radio interfaces for the actual transmission of the data.
Right.
So as you pass the data through the radio interfaces, they need to be not only enabled in the menu, but they actually need to turn themselves on, power themselves up, transmit, receive. All of that takes power. Now, different interfaces take different amount of power. 4G is the most hungry. 3G takes less power, maybe 1.5 times less. Wi-Fi will take maybe another 3 times less. And Bluetooth will take maybe another 5 times less. And one of the great things about using mesh networking for internet access is that you can now offload from expensive connections to less expensive connections. This tends to mean that you offload from mobile connections to Wi-Fi connections.
Right.
What happens when you get data off mobile connections onto Wi-Fi connections are several things. One, you don't use the data plan, which is nice.
Yes.
2, you consume less energy system-wide. The additional 1 or 2 hops of Bluetooth still will not consume nearly as much energy as you save by switching from 3G to Wi-Fi.
Okay.
So system-wide, you can experience reductions of energy consumption. Now, if the system consumes less energy, that means that the average consumption is also less. And on average, that means that any particular device can also consume less battery.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Actually, a lot of that I had no idea. So I'm glad you're sharing that, because that is interesting, because you're right. Those rituals exist. And what a great point on how implementing something like Open Garden, A, it can save you money, B, it can save you a lot of energy, on your phone and whatever else. And yeah, that is pretty wild. If I want to switch gears a little bit and ask why Open Garden? Like what was the inspiration to make Open Garden? I mean, was it just okay, this needs to exist in the world, or what exactly was running through everyone's mind?
Well, on my side, I've been interested in this style of networking since early 2000s.
Okay.
The hardware wasn't there to use it. Wi-Fi appeared, but with Wi-Fi as it existed then, you could connect either to other devices or to an access point. You could not do both.
Right.
Connecting to other devices and talking just to them typically is not what users want. Also, Wi-Fi devices at the time were laptops at best.
Right.
And laptops are off most of the time. When you carry them in a backpack, their Wi-Fi is not running. And it is the emergence of smartphones that really enables Open Garden style networking. And once we saw the deployment of smartphones, we tried to figure out, can we put something in this style of networking onto these phones? And as we were starting, this wasn't obvious. Open Garden provides features that are normally provided by the operating system kernel. So putting it not just in user space and not just in a non-privileged application in user space, but into a mobile app, into that sandbox of highly limited functions, at first may seem impossible. But it turns out that Android in particular has enough hooks to implement everything that Open Garden needs. So it wasn't so much about why, but more about when. And
a question of when. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I like that.
It's the smartphone density that enabled that. The why is a different story. We have routing on the internet that is ancient and needs improvements. At any one time, it is only possible to access one network. I have Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon at home. But if one of these networks goes down, computers at home don't automatically reroute over other networks unless they run Open Garden.
Okay.
And when I need more speed, they don't automatically take from all these existing connections. And Open Garden is about solving these limitations, about optimizing how people access internet.
All right, I love it. I mean, now that's like the very essence of, like I guess I'll say the pure term of like hacking, where you're just making what you have work as good as it possibly can. And I think that's great. So, would you be willing to explain, like, I mean, was it just that at home you couldn't take advantage of everything that you wanted? Would you be willing to go into more about, why in the early 2000s you were wanting this kind of network? Was it just because it didn't exist?
Well, I'm interested in computer networking. That's what I do. And I think that there are several areas in computer networking, so several big open problems that we need to work on. I think that there are basically three: transport, routing, and provisioning. And I've had a chance to work on transport by developing congestion control used in BitTorrent, and I thought that I would try to make a contribution to routing space as well by making Open Garden.
Okay, so now, and so you had a history in BitTorrent, which of course is peer-to-peer, and I can definitely see the relation where that would work similar, or where they do work similarly. That's great. I'm curious too, real quick, actually, is where do you know where the name Open Garden came from? Like what was the thinking behind that?
Misha, my business partner, is the one who brought the name in, and the idea is that all the devices can connect to each other, everything can talk to each other, instead of having these closed silos of carrier-specific networks that don't talk to each other, that are closed Franciscan gardens, if you will, all walled off. We would
Walled off gardens. Got
open
it.
them and let them talk to each other.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, the name rolls off the tongue, admittedly, and now that you mentioned that, I as soon as you said walled off gardens, I was like, aha, there it is, open gardens. That's clever. I like it. Another couple questions that I have are. One is that, okay, so you have all these devices connecting to each other. I mean, you also mentioned that the implementation is to be able to allow different internet access points to be able, to be able to use all of them at the same time. But like on, especially on the smartphone side of things, you have all these devices, talking to each other. I can see where some people would be worrying about security. Security of their data hopping around on all these different devices. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any addresses on that?
Sure. So connections between the devices and Open Garden are encrypted.
Okay.
But ultimately, Open Garden is not a security solution. If you're worried about security, you should use a security solution such as TLS, SSH, VPNs. Open Garden provides access to the internet. We may be thinking about how we can contribute to the security space as well, but you get internet access out of Open Garden. Previously, if you didn't have Open Garden, your data would flow however you chose, whether encrypted or in plain text, over the air, accessible to anyone to see. With Open Garden, you get that same data flowing in the same way, except that now it's flowing in more places and faster. Whether the data is encrypted or not does not change. The ultimate answer for people who really care about security is end-to-end encryption.
Yeah, which I think that actually that's a perfect answer, is that's not what Open Garden is here to do. They're not here to, it's not a security program, it's a communications program. It's a way for people, in whatever circumstances to be able to have their data flow, and their connection. Yeah, that's as solid as an answer as I could expect. So, yeah, fantastic. The second question is, and this is something that, myself, I'm not too terribly concerned about, but I know there are people out there that would worry about this. And the question is okay, now Open Garden is a closed source program, and there's a lot of people who, the Richard Stallman types who are like, oh no, everything must be open source or I will not touch it, which I think is very, very extreme. And I sympathize and I understand where they're coming from, I guess. But what would you say to them, if they said, well, look, I want to use Open Garden. I think it's a great idea, but it's not open source. So I'm very concerned about touching it. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
If you only use open source software, then you should not use Open Garden. You should also not use Android, so you wouldn't be able to run Open Garden in the first place. Now, we as a founding team created open source software that 250 million people use. So we care about this. We probably more than the average person who is a user of open source software, and we want Open Garden to succeed. What role open source has in that strategy is too early to talk about now, but stay tuned for that.
Sure. No, fair enough. I mean, this, a lot of people forget too that a lot of the people, even like say today, that are big stalwarts in the tech world for open source software and things of that nature, they worked in closed source companies. I mean, that's how they got their start, and that's how they got to where they are now. So it doesn't, just because, someone's like, oh, we've got to be open source now, they weren't always so. And sometimes it's just something that comes down, later down the line or whichever. Fair enough answer, on that. I mean, did you, something I knew this, I had this interview coming up, and I had some questions from some of my listeners, and one of them were you thinking, that, what if the government turns off the internet? Is that why you made Open Garden? Do you have any response to that? I thought it was an interesting question.
It is an interesting question. And some of the functions of Open Garden can be helpful in darknet scenarios. It's not the primary motivation. And the reason is very simple. If you want software to work well, it needs to be used by a lot of people. It needs to be thoroughly tested. If you wait until you need a darknet, something will probably not work then. It needs to work beforehand. The part that is missing right now is not really the creation of raw connectivity between nodes without presence of internet infrastructure, but communication applications that would take advantage of it. If you look at communication apps on Android, for example, even the apps that support peer-to-peer and could theoretically work disconnected, like Skype that we're using now to talk to each other,
right,
do not support disconnected operation. If two Skype users are connected to each other but not to the internet, they will not be able to place calls between each other. So what the missing piece right now are communication apps. Once that missing piece exists, Open Garden will be more useful in situations like this.
Okay. No, fair enough. Just another question is that somebody who was going to use it, they noticed that there wasn't a Linux version. Any thoughts on, is that something that's coming? Is that something that will be perhaps popular by demand?
Well, we're a very small team. We already support many platforms, probably too many platforms. The need to support Android, Mac, and Windows is already a drain on resources. Realistically, to support Linux, we would need some reason to support it, more than the small handful of people who run Linux on the desktop.
Right.
In a way, we already support Linux by supporting Android. If there is a need for Linux for Open Garden on, say, home routers, which are also Linux-based, that would be an interesting direction, but we would need a deployment plan.
Right.
It's a question of our resources. Right? We don't support many operating systems.
Right. Now, it's interesting you mentioned about putting it onto routers. I mean, is there... I guess I'm wondering what, where do you see the future of Open Garden going? I mean, like that, because that really, when you mentioned that, I was intrigued. Now, I mean, what do you think would come out of that with Open Garden? And then also, if you would, where do you see Open Garden? What are your ideas for the future with it?
Open Garden is a general enabling technology that makes internet better. The more places deployed, the better. So universal deployment would bring improvement to all users. How exactly that happens, which way we go, that remains unclear, whether this will be driven by users individually installing it on their devices as it is today, or by vendors of operating systems installing it, or by some other means of distribution. That's open question.
Okay. No, but yeah, I'm interested. I mean, do you look at all at other companies that are doing more of a mesh networking type of thing? Do you feel that Open Garden has any real competition out there? I mean, myself, I look around and I don't see everything that Open Garden can do. I don't really see alternatives. Are you aware of any alternatives? Is there?
No, we don't really have anything that would do everything that we do.
Right.
Or even work in the same space of a mobile app that creates a mesh network. The competition to Open Garden is mainly substitution competition, right? Just not using any mesh networking. And,
right.
Using things like tethering, which is clunky and requires you to pay for it and requires you to remember to turn it off. But nonetheless, it's a substitution competition, right? Instead of using a car, people can walk.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Okay, yeah. So I mean that I consider that credible in itself. I mean, some people they've come up with the things like, well, again, with the whole open source business, I'm happy just to see in very much of the proof of concept, but I mean, it really works. I use Open Garden and it does exactly what it says it does. And that is amazing, and I don't think anyone, I'm excited myself to see where this is going to go. how many people end up start using it. I certainly recommend it, to my listeners. An interesting point, though, is that this is not available for iOS. Is that right?
No, it is not. We, again, have limited resources. iOS is obviously a much bigger market than Linux, and
right.
therefore a higher priority for us. But it's operating system, a mobile operating system, where Apple has a very clear vision of how the user will be interacting with the apps. And it's a small miracle that Open Garden is able to work on Android, that Android is open enough and flexible enough to be able to take a concept like Open Garden and put it into the mobile app sandbox bucket.
Right.
On iOS, this is harder to do. We have some ideas, we have some progress, but there is not yet a version that people can use.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is something that's a lot of people, even something as popular, you may have heard of this, of Bitcoin, something that's really going all around the world, and becoming a big deal. On iOS, there are no native Bitcoin iOS apps, which, is just mind blowing in that I understand where Apple's coming from. They like their system to be really, really tight knit. But that's a shame that, that it's so tight knit that there's a lot of really interesting, technologies and new software coming out like Open Garden that just can't take advantage of the user base, or that can't be to the advantage of the user base, not necessarily taking advantage of them. And that's really a shame. Do you have any other thoughts on that? Is that something, do you see Open Garden coming out for iOS in the future? I know, like you said, limited resources, no doubt about it, but is that something that can happen, or is it something that just may never, ever happen?
Well, we'd love to bring Open Garden for iOS. And if Open Garden is to be universally deployed everywhere, iOS is obviously an important market segment, particularly on mobile, where this is one of the two major operating systems. It will take longer than with Android, because with Android, we did not need Google's special permission to do anything.
Right.
You can use any APIs, can put it out in the Google Play Store without any permissions. On iOS, everything is difficult, or more difficult compared to Android from the developer point of view. I understand where Apple is coming from, controlling it so tightly, trying to protect the user experience. And I'm sure that Apple users appreciate this. Ultimately, I think this is a question for the market to resolve. And if Open Garden provides utility to Android users, then Apple will be able to see it, and then there will be incentives for it to exist on iOS.
Yeah, no, actually, great point in that, the market is really the one that has to say to Apple, you need to open up your iOS a little, open up your stuff a little bit. I mean, OS X, Open Garden is on OS X. Of course, OS X is, a Unix base. And so that's not so tightly knit, as to where you were able to, to make it happen on there. Which is great. I really hope so. I mean, generally on this show, I recommend to people, if the question comes up, and it does, what if I want a smartphone, do I go Android? Do I go iOS? And iOS, there's that ease of use and protection to the user, no doubt about it. But I mean, if a person wants real options like Open Garden, to where, you can communicate the way you want to, or under, various conditions that one wasn't able to before. I usually tell them, to go with Android. That's a real shame, because I think, I would love to see iOS open up just a little bit with all of this stuff. Fascinating stuff. Is there anything else you wanted to get out on about Open Garden?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Brian, and to address your listeners. I hope that people try Open Garden, and I hope that they find it useful for them. We are still working on it. It's an evolving product. It gets better with every release, which we do often. So try it. Let us know how it works. We have an active user community on the forum. Paige, with whom you've met personally, is our community manager. She builds this community and helps people connect with other Open Garden Garden users define common interests. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show.
Oh, no. Thank you, Stas. It was great. And yeah, I definitely recommend to my listeners, opengarden.com. Check it out, use it. And you're absolutely right. It gets updated often, which is always a great thing for any app, especially in the Google Play Store. And you can find it there by typing in Open Garden. And thank you again, Stas, for being on. And this has been Sovryn Tech. I've been Brian Sovryn, and we'll see you next time.
This has been Sovryn Tech. Visit us at sovryntech.com. That's SOVRYN tech.com. There you can connect with us, see more of what you've heard on today's show, and catch our podcast feed. Sovryn Tech is open source. We encourage you to share. Later, nerds.